right now I'm going to get an opportunity to bring in some other entrepreneurs that are doing things, not just here in central Pennsylvania, but all across the United States. So this is going to be the lightning round section where a bunch of us are going to get up and we're going to do very short bursts, 5 minutes. So it's going to be myself starting. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we're doing here and what it means to develop a mech ecosystem versus a tech ecosystem. And later on I'll be doing a larger breakout where you'll learn a little bit more about what we're doing on a grander scale. Matt Lewis, the director of Make It, MSP Greater Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. Ashlee Ammons, president of Mixtroz, Birmingham, Alabama. Amy Bridger, the senior director of corporate strategy and external engagement, Penn State in Erie. And Emily Lohse-Busch, executive director, Art Grants, St. Louis, Missouri. All right, let's see if we can get my slide up. All right, great. So I will kick things off. We're at the beginning of what experts are calling the second machine age. You might hear it the fourth industrial revolution. There's a whole bunch of terms. The important thing to remember is that what's about to happen is fundamentally going to change what it means to be a human, not just our economy. Think back if you were in 1890 and someone was going to tell you could fly. You'd slap them in the face. Like, it just sounds ridiculous. And yet within their lifetime, they could not only fly like a bird, they could fly faster than a bird. Right? That's what's about to happen within our lifetime in a very, very short period of time. Now, one of the things we're focused on here in York is this idea of not creating a tech ecosystem. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in my breakout. I actually had a tech startup several years ago, and we looked, acted, and talked just like a San Francisco startup. And the DNA here killed it. It just did not work. In fact, I realized very quickly that I was doing imitation and calling it innovation. So I had to go back to the drawing board and figure out what could I do that would actually be something that would be inclusive of the community that's here. So think less Facebook in 2013, right? Like, I don't know that we need any more filters where you could throw up rainbows on Instagram. And I don't know that that's actually going to help the economy here in York. So less like Facebook in 2013, and more like Ford Motors in 1913. See, there were 1,800 other automobile makers when Henry Ford created the Model T, but they were all made by craftsmen and engineers. So a team of specialists would make one automobile. Henry Ford found a way to have an army of regular people build thousands and millions. That's what we're focused on. That's the difference between tech versus mech. A mech ecosystem needs PhDs, all the way down to robot mechanics, which is what we're training. So why York? You guys are going to hear me talk about this a little bit in my breakout if you're interested. The truth is, York saved the world in 1940, and we don't even talk about it. In fact, the only mention of it is this mural, and it's 3 blocks that way in a McDonald's parking lot. So seriously, if you want to hear the story, it's a freaking awesome story, and we're bringing it back in the form of the York Plan 2.0, but this time, we're going to prepare the heartland for the advent of artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, and quite frankly, national defense. China is moving very fast with the Made in China 2025 initiative. Within 5 to 10 years, when the baby boomers retire, the market will be flooded with cheap Chinese robots that can be hacked or turned off. This is a big deal. So, this is what we're focused on. We created the Fortress Academy. It was the first of its kind, accelerated education institution licensed by the state of Pennsylvania, all of accelerated education in artificial intelligence and robotics, with the goal of creating the first generation of robot mechanics. 2 workforces, 1 robotic and 1 caretaker. We're actually proving that out right now. This is Daniel. He was our first graduate of the Fortress Academy, had no higher education, had never seen a robot before, and in 15 weeks became our first robot mechanic. He learned welding, PLC, computer programming, service and repair. And now he's going out on calls that I used to have to send bachelor's and master's degrees out on. And luckily for us, he was also a Marine, worked in the motor pool. So very good with his hands. But this is going to be a very big deal, so it's going to require a very large scale plan. So that's why we founded the York Plan 2.0 Innovation District, just 3 blocks from here. It is a federal opportunity zone and the last largest undeveloped piece of land within the city. We are building a 240,000 square foot campus, an innovation district, will be the first of its kind in the world where humans and robots will work alongside each other. Now, I'm going to wrap up in 1 second and hand it off to some of the other presenters. But we were told that tech startups couldn't flourish here. One of the prevailing wisdom is it's hard to attract talent. Well, I can tell you right now, we've done this in about 18 months. Now, the 18 months was a lot of preparation. There were years and years and years leading up to this. But York Exponential and the Fortress has been growing very, very rapidly. And our profile is starting to attract a lot of other people that are coming to see something special happen in York. Now, the big thing I think for all of us to understand is, while in the past things may have been difficult, we are at a tipping point. There will be companies built within the next 5 years that will last 1,000 years. Right? The decisions we make now won't just affect our community, it won't just affect our family, it will affect our children, our grandchildren, our great-great-grandchildren, and ultimately our nation. So I'm hoping the takeaway for today is that everyone here will understand how important this conversation is, but how important it is for us to move. So thank you very much. If you want to hear some more about the York plan, my breakout is, I believe, at 10:45, but I will now hand it over to whoever would like to go next. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I was willing to cede the floor, but I think my slides are up there, so let's make sure that's true and get started. There we go. So I'm here to, for 5 minutes, bring you to Minneapolis, St. Paul, out of York for a few minutes. And so this is a shot of Minneapolis. This is the Mississippi River. For those of you who haven't been there, St. Anthony Falls is up in that right there. The falls helped us create companies like Pillsbury, what we now know as General Mills, more than 150 years ago. I live just a few blocks up from the falls. And every morning, I normally start my mornings by traveling a road down the river, which is actually a national park, past our Minneapolis Business District. You see the US Bank Stadium. We're hosting the Final Four next Saturday. And then on my way to St. Paul, past our Tier 1 Research University, where I got my graduate degrees. It's a great way to start my mornings. And it's a great community. Oftentimes we show pictures of buildings and rivers and things that we're proud of in our community, but a community is made up of people, right? And the people in Minneapolis, St. Paul are amazing. They're not all as gawky and embarrassing as I am. They're great people, but they're equally committed as I am to solving problems and working together. And that nature has caused them to, over the last, well, more than 100 years, but particularly in the last few decades, invent some of the most kind of surprising products and pioneer some of the most exciting developments. So you see a few of those up here, from open heart surgery to the pacemaker, from the supercomputer that we actually developed, much like the York story that we didn't talk about much as a region, to everything from Post-it notes to Cheerios to things that you invent in Minnesota like snow blowers and thermostats. Right? So we invented all those things. And by doing that, by solving real problems, many of them were problems for us, particularly that snowblower one, we accessed global markets, right? And by being problem solvers, we were able to grow amazing companies. So over the last half century, we've actually grown 50 Fortune 500 companies in our community. They didn't move there. They grew. We nurtured that. And there's a leading professor of corporate strategy at the University of Minnesota who spent the last 5 years studying, why are we a headquarters economy? Why did that happen? And it comes back to the people, right? So people over the last half century stayed in Minneapolis, St. Paul at the highest rates of any major metro in the country. And what happened is they took that knowledge that they gained at a managerial level and an executive level, and they transferred that knowledge at the intersection of industries, right? And so by doing that, they created this virtuous cycle that kept feeding off itself. And today that story continues, right? So a lot of these companies that are up here today, they don't exist anymore, right? So we don't have 50 Fortune 500 companies today, but we still have the most per capita, and we're leading in a lot of really exciting areas. You can see some of them up there. The best way to illustrate it would be just what's happening in our region today. So while I'm on this stage, the world's most innovative medical device company, leading hospital, and largest health insurer, all based in Minnesota, are meeting at a med tech pitch session. Our governor tonight and 5 of the 30 largest food companies in the world are gathered at a reverse pitch session, all of them based in Minnesota, to pitch entrepreneurs from around the world. And tomorrow about 1,000 folks from other Fortune 500 companies are gathered out at an event focused on AI and automation and marketing and analytics. And that's just the next 24 hours in our region. And the way that our region works, it still works, is that we collaborate. And there's something special in the water, whether it's in the Mississippi River or in our lakes that have started to unfreeze over the last few weeks, where we give We volunteer. We do things like vote at the highest rates in the country. We're very civically active, right? We're committed to the other people in our community. And by collaborating, we kind of continue that virtuous cycle I talked about. So a couple things that we've been working on over the last few years that mix that people orientation with that collaborative spirit are things that I'll talk about more in the breakout session. One of them is an initiative I direct called Make It MSP that came out of an ambition to make our region one of the top 10 performers in the country at attracting and retaining talent. So we've been doing that for a couple of years. Over the last 2 years, we've increased our net migration of millennials by 3x, thousands more people per year, and we think we're gonna get to the top 10 in the next 5 years. And we did that not through the institutions we have, but by gathering people from those institutions. We took the kind of wealth and capital and knowledge in those institutions, but we created a decision-making process where 200 people from community organizations get together and decide how we're gonna do that work. And we started by listening to thousands of people around the world to entertain what we're gonna do. We're doing that same thing now in our startup ecosystem, so I'm teasing here today something that we're gonna announce this summer, where we're taking all these amazing assets that our region has created over the last few years and trying to come up with a joint strategy for how we accelerate our ecosystem and set even more bold ambitions than being top 10 in migration of people. So the biggest challenge we have is not our assets, it's creating a sense of urgency when sometimes we can be complacent. Despite all that prosperity that's been created, we have some of the largest disparities by race anywhere in the country. And we know that all of those institutions that I talked about will look a lot different in 10 years. Half of them will probably be gone, right? We'll see disruption across all of our industries. So how do you create that sense of urgency when we might be complacent that we're leading in areas today? That's what we'll be talking about in our session with my friend Stephanie Rich, who's a former Internet of Things executive at Particle, and is bringing that urgency to our startup ecosystem. And we hope to hear from you about how you're creating urgency in your communities and the things that you're doing. We're gonna talk a little bit about our region, but we wanna listen and learn from you. That's why all of us are here. So that's what we'll be doing in our breakout session. Thanks for having me.
I'm gonna get it to work, don't worry. Maybe not. Okay, it worked a little bit too good. Okay, good morning, everybody. Are y'all awake? Good morning. Okay, good morning. So I am Ashlee Ammons, and I am co-founder of a tech startup called Mixtroz. I am probably the least likely person here that looks like they founded a tech startup. I'm just not the person that you guys are looking for, which is fine. The tides are turning, things are changing. So what I'm here to talk to you about is what my experience has been as a Black female tech founder, which is actually called a quad outsider, if you guys aren't familiar with that term. So to give you guys an idea of where we came from, in 2014, I was at a conference kind of just like this. It was an all-women's conference, but over lunch, the event organizer said, go up to someone with the same color dot on their name tag as you. That was supposed to be the networking function. This was very awkward. Women, they put their name tags on their breast area, then you gotta look for a dot, then you have to say, I'm blue, you're blue, let's talk about being blue. Very awkward. Didn't want to do it. But what that led to, that single moment led my mom and I to have a conversation about there's a lot of technology to get you to events. There's a lot of technology to help you follow up after events, but what is the technology that forces the collision between you and other attendees while you're actually there? Thus, our company, Mixtroz. We founded Mixtroz in 2014. We are the quintessential entrepreneur story, yet we didn't recognize the world was not ready for the quad outsider. Not to mention the fact that we were located in the Southeast. I have a baby boomer on my team, so that is really messing with my age average for the all-important millennial, right? And we happen to be mother-daughter. Turns out investors really don't want to hear that. As you can see, my mom and I's backgrounds are pretty impressive. We were two Black female professionals at the top of our game. My mom, an HR executive, and myself, my claim to fame was I was LeBron James' first intern, but guess what? Investors don't want to hear about that either. This is what people said about us in Nashville. Anytime we would come to people with our idea, and we were gung-ho, we're out there, they said, you have a great idea, except you're a Black female in the Southeast. This will not work out for you. And my answer to that was, do you have any advice about something that I could change? The Black female part I really can't do anything with. But again, they didn't really have an answer for that. So we stayed in Nashville for 3 years, hustling our business along. And this is difficult because a tech startup is supposed to be high growth, fast growth, but we didn't see that because we did not have the support of the ecosystem that we were in. So this all changed in 2017. In 2017, I'm gonna take you through this story pretty quickly. So the t-shirt at the top, the full shirt says, Black Female Founder Fund Me. On the back of that t-shirt it says, Got Seed. My mom and I wore these t-shirts to Collision Conference in New Orleans. Reason being, people never could figure out why we were at the conference. They either thought we were Gail and Oprah, or they seriously came up to my mom and I and asked them to get them a gin and tonic. Literally, I can't tell you what my mom's reply to that was. So while we were at that conference and we wore those shirts, we caused a stir. At this point, we recognized we're gonna stick out anyway, so we used it to our advantage. And when you do that, magic starts to happen. So first, we got our first national article in Forbes, which ran. To this point, we've been in Forbes quite a few times. The second thing that happened is we connected with an organization called CBC USA. They're based in Albuquerque. They invited us to come down for a pitch competition. We won that pitch competition. They then sent us to Copenhagen, where we represented the US, 2 Black female founders, and we also won our category in Copenhagen, proving to us that the problem we're solving for is actually a global thing, not just limited to the US. And finally, and most importantly, we met the executive director of a program called Velocity, which is in Birmingham, Alabama. Only 2.5 hours from Nashville, but completely not on our radar. When we got to Birmingham, this is what happened. That's a picture of my mom and I with the mayor of Birmingham, Randall Woodfin. Not only do we want you, but we support you 100%. This is the feeling I get when I'm in my new home of Birmingham, Alabama. To them, I was never some black chick with a tech startup. I was an entrepreneur with a business that was growing, and they got behind me and supported it. To further that, this is what Alabama is saying about Mixtroz. In this picture is a group of our new seed round investors. So in the 3 years that I was in Nashville, couldn't raise funding, couldn't grow my business. 1 year in Birmingham, because of the support going on in the ecosystem, we completed an accelerator. We won Steve Case's Rise to the Rest when it came through Birmingham, $100,000 into my business. We then went on to raise another $900,000. In fact, one of our investors, Neil Wright, is here with us today from Bronze Valley. And that makes my mom and I the 37th and 38th Black females to ever close $1 million round of funding. Amazing. Thank you. So as I am wrapping up, and this is what we can dig in on the session, the thing that Birmingham is doing that I haven't seen before is the way the ecosystem is flowing together. They are not siloed, they are working together. And even in these small ecosystems, you may be thinking they're getting outshadowed by the people in Atlanta or Nashville, but what makes Birmingham special is that they can fail fast and pivot and correct themselves. They don't fail fast, they don't fail, draw out the fail process and then write a white paper about it. They fail fast and make changes, and that's why we're thriving there. They've allowed me to create a business that does this at events where people are connecting for my customers. Thank you so much.
All right. Should have asked Ashlee what her trick was. Okay. All right. Do you know what I love about undergraduate students? It is the fact that they say yes first and then panic later. And it's true because the world has not yet put the weight of the world on their shoulders. So when you talk about undergraduates, they are amazingly adept at doing this change and pivoting, as Ashlee was mentioning. For us at Penn State Behrend, this is a huge deal, and that's why they are the most important piece of the puzzle for us. I am Amy Bridger. I'm the Senior Director of Corporate Strategy at Penn State Erie, the Behrend College. Most of you who think of Penn State University think of University Park, smack dab in the center of the state. And that's notable because they for sure have the majority of the 90,000 plus students and the $900 million of sponsored research that happens through Penn State. However, Penn State is a distributed 20-campus system, and Penn State Behrend has a few notables of their own. Number one, we are the first in the United States to co-locate the business and engineering schools under the same roof. We have the first Invent Penn State launch box in Erie. We are the first campus outside of University Park to give a 4-year degree. We have the largest annual research expenditures outside of University Park. We have students from all the states and 40 countries. We have a couple of interesting programs that are only available at Behrend, including international business. We have the only accredited computer science program in all of Penn State. We have one of the first software engineering programs in the country and still remains the only one in the Penn State system. And we have a unique interdisciplinary business and engineering degree only found at Behrend. We are the host of Pennsylvania's Sea Grant College. We have the largest undergraduate enrollment outside of University Park. 4,300 undergraduate students out of 5,200 students strong at Penn State Behrend. And what that should tell you is that we have the smallness and the agile to test anything you want, but we are large enough to be a really awesome test bed for scalability, and we utilize that to our greatest extent. We have more than 350 companies that visit us each year. We have innovative alumni all across the globe doing things like we have 2 NASA space directors and a Nike innovator. We have the largest academic plastics lab in the country, probably the world. We just haven't been anywhere yet. We have the first Industry 4.0 course that was taught this spring in a fully IIoT-enabled plastics lab. We actually have a consignment model that actually meshes the external industry with our student experience and how we work together. And 3/4 of the students that start at Penn State Behrend graduate from Behrend. We have the only public university as Penn State that has such an industry favorable intellectual property policy that happened in 2012, where if industry sponsors the research, they own the intellectual property. We are still the only ones that have that favorable intellectual property policy. And what does that mean? It means that companies like SKF, the largest global manufacturer of bearings in the world, located their first United States-based innovation center in Penn State Erie at Knowledge Park. Knowledge Park is a 106-acre business, research, and technology park located adjacent to campus. You might be asking yourself, why would SKF do that? Why would they show up in 2011 with no prior connection to Penn State Behrend or Penn State, to be honest, and now 7 years later, they are the 5th largest corporate partner of research in the entirety of Penn State, and it's all through Penn State Behrend. The answer is our open lab strategy, which is actually decades in the making, probably 40 years of culture shifting to allow the external world, industry, nonprofits, for-profits, whatever, to embed and integrate in the campus culture at Penn State Behrend, which embeds itself in the educational experience of our students. And then in 2010, we decided we were going to really reduce as many barriers as we could, from anywhere from who we hire, how we hire them, where we advertise, promotion and tenure, how we reward people, intellectual property, doing applied research on a daily basis. And we wanted to shorten the trip between the academic learning and the application of that learning as we go forward. And when I say shorten the trip, I really mean walk across the street. This is a picture of Knowledge Park. Students can leave class, go across the street to their job, throw a couple of specimens in the lab to run, go back to class, and come back a few hours later. It is really that easy. We have 20 tenants, over 500 employees in the park, including faculty-led spinoffs. If you notice a snapshot of our tenants, number one, you're going to notice a lot of manufacturers. And one of our things is to actually bring manufacturing into the rebirth of the next age. Half of these companies came to the park after the 2012 intellectual property change and our strategy of open lab. That's important to note. When we talk about new engagements, we have the Innovation Commons, 57 development projects. It is a rapid prototyping development center. We have students sitting there wanting to get ideas out of people's heads and the community, faculty, staff, students, and then the community at large, free of charge to come in and get an idea out of your head into a rapid prototype model. These students are named inventors as undergraduates on 7, now 8 different patent applications. We have 6 products on the market and 4 companies started in just 3 short years. Please come to our breakout session. We'd be glad to have you drive our robots through our largest academic plastics lab, our Innovation Commons rapid prototyping space, and you can actually take a tour with a robot through the Advanced Manufacturing Innovation Center upstairs. Our studio breakout is through that door. It's a little bit different than anyone else. Up the elevator to the 2nd floor. You'll probably hear us before you see us. Thank you.
Walk slow so I don't have to wait for that slide. Oh, didn't work. All right. So most of us are in this room today because in one way or another, we work in the field of economic development, whether that be for a demographic, for a specific region, or for an industry. I personally fall squarely into the bucket of economic development for a region. My name's Lohse-Busch, and I'm the executive director of an organization called Arch Grants, and I'm honored to be here today representing St. Louis, Missouri, and specifically how we're leveraging our strengths to build our economy from the ground up. So when you think about St. Louis, you may have some notions about what it represents. our citizens definitely have some notions about what we represent. There's that good old Midwestern humility, which may be the reason why you actually have no idea what St. Louis represents. There's beer, there's Cardinals baseball, there's the signs of decline that many Rust Belt cities have experienced over the past several decades as Fortune 500 companies have left and urban sprawl has changed our landscape. I grew up in St. Louis, or more accurately, in a suburb, and I left about 15 years ago with no intention of ever coming back. But at some point during that time that I was away, living first in Chicago and then in DC, I started hearing rumblings of changes in my hometown, of a transformation. One of my trips back to visit my family, I actually took some time to really look. And while I found an urban core that was by no means completely transformed, it was by all accounts completely electric. The best way I can describe what I felt several years ago moving back to St. Louis is that it's buzzing in a way that it wasn't when I left long ago. More and more people are recognizing that the status quo just isn't doing it. And that while we don't have to change who we are as a city, we do have to change the way that we view those attributes. We're scrappy, we're curious, we're discerning, we're diverse. We're open and we're supportive of one another. We're one of the ripest environments I've seen for embracing startups and helping them to thrive. Which leads me to the organization that I now lead, Arch Grants. We're an aggressive effort founded by several St. Louis leaders to build the future economy in St. Louis by attracting and retaining extraordinary entrepreneurs. We start by attracting startups to St. Louis through our global startup competition, where we award $50,000 non-dilutive grants every year to 20 early-stage businesses. The $1 million that we award every year is not only funded largely by the individuals and corporations within St. Louis, and notice that I did mention that we're a nonprofit, so all of that money is philanthropic in nature. But over 500 venture capitalists, corporate leaders, civic leaders in St. Louis actually determine what companies we're going to fund by serving as our judges and evaluators. All we ask of the companies is that they locate in St. Louis for a period of 1 year and give us the chance to show them what it looks like and feels like to have an entire region cheering you on and propelling you forward. And that's where the magic happens. So if you'll humor me for a second, I'm going to tell you a story about an imaginary Arch Grant recipient to help illustrate what it can look like for an entrepreneur to find their home in St. Louis. So this recipient, we'll call her Anna, received her Arch Grant in 2013 and moved from New York to an apartment that could finally fit a bed and a couch. Through Arch Grants, she was immediately connected into an ecosystem that, while still developing, welcomed her with open arms. She was connected with professional service vendors and technology solutions pro bono to help her navigate her biggest challenge, scaling in an already crowded direct-to-consumer online marketplace. Ultimately, a trusted mentor, who was himself a serial entrepreneur and an Arch Grants donor, gave her the advice that she already knew in her heart. It was time to let this idea go and move on to something else. As soon as she pulled the plug, she felt an enormous release, as she now finally had the time and energy to devote to her new idea in the AI-enabled consumer product space, which had developed as an outcome of her field research for her first product. The network she'd developed in St. Louis was still there to support her, so she stayed and started her next venture in 2015, and has had significant success. She was floored by the way St. Louis embraced her from the start, and so now that she has a little bit more time and resources, she's investing back into the community. In 2016, she rented a floor for her growing staff downtown, and then just 2 years later, she purchased a vacant building to grow out her team. She serves on a nonprofit board focused on underserved students in St. Louis, and this year started teaching at Washington University in their entrepreneurship department. She consults for St. Louis businesses as they navigate the changing AI landscape. And on the personal side, she met her partner a few years ago, and they bought a home with room for multiple beds and couches. And in her spare time, she now serves as a resource and mentor for Arch Grant recipients. Now, While that story is fiction, every single one of the things I just mentioned has happened and is happening every day in St. Louis. The entrepreneurs we attract are not just transforming the economy, they're transforming our regional culture. Arch Grants alone has funded 134 companies. 109 of them are still in business and 85% are still in St. Louis. They've attracted over $243 million. They've generated $243 million in revenue and attracted $223 million in follow-on funding and created almost 1,700 jobs. And a stat that's not up there, but we're very proud of, is that 74% of the companies that we've funded are either led or co-led by a woman, a person of color, a veteran, or an immigrant. When you think about Anna's story and multiply that by thousands, each one a founder who is finding their place in St. Louis through Arch Grants or BioSTL or the Cortex Innovation Community or T-Rex, each of whom is being supported by the myriad corporate and educational resources readily willing to help, it's easy to see why St. Louis is buzzing with potential. And it's easy to see why Forbes recently ranked us the #2 city for rising startups in the US. St. Louis's story is being written right now. And I hope to be able to dig in a little bit deeper with all of you and hear your own stories of your own regions in our breakout session. Thank you.
All right. Hey, everyone. So thank you for working with us as we're calling all audibles on this. But we thought that actually we'd have a really good conversation here with everybody about how their communities have really built up their entrepreneurial ecosystems. So I am Skylar Yost. I'm the ecosystem builder for York. I have been a big part of working with VentureBeat on making sure that this thing goes off. And one of the things that we're doing here, as far as we're aware, I'm the first municipal ecosystem builder in the world, maybe? So our entire goal is to get to a point where we can talk about York's ecosystem in a few years' time and say, this is how we actually did it. We're building community amongst people that are trying to start businesses and trying to grow their businesses. We're finding ways to support them as much as possible, and we're learning from other places. I made a trip up to Erie, and that's part of how this connection happened. They're doing amazing things in their environment, building collaborations. So we're gonna kick it off a little bit with specifically focusing on something that Ashlee talked about a little bit, is how can your community and a community of entrepreneurs really support each other in a way that helps the startup businesses take off. So I'd like to throw it to you. What has been the most successful thing about your time in Birmingham? Where do you think they hit it really well?
Yeah, I mean, like, case in point, like, I'm looking out in the audience and like my mom is here with me, co-founder, that's great. But then also I have Neil Wright. Neil, can you raise your hand? Okay, Neil Wright, who is the executive director of Bronze Valley, which is an investor of Mixtroz. And so the thing that entrepreneurs do not need more of is that arbitrary pat on the back thing that you do when you see an entrepreneur at an event and you say something like, oh, you have a business? That's so great. Good job. We know. Like, we know. Like, being an entrepreneur is hard. Like, if we're still in it, likely something's going well enough for us to still be in it because we're not nuts, right? Like, we still have bills to pay, same as you, all of this. It's like, sometimes as an entrepreneur, you feel like a zoo animal because it's like people are like looking at you like, oh my gosh, why would you do that? You don't get a regular paycheck. But it's the people and the places that take that extra step. It's the willingness to take that no thank you bite. So what I found in Birmingham is of the buildings that are in the skyline, I'm confident in saying 60% of them are customers of ours. That's what's meaningful to me as a startup entrepreneur. entrepreneur. They're coming in that way. And then also, it's the funding piece, right? Like, we're a startup. Something that I noticed in startup land today is there's like a sliding scale for what a startup is. Some people think a startup is something that is being bootstrapped, is just getting off the ground, a little bit of early traction. Some people think a startup is Microsoft. So it's not Microsoft, let me tell you that. And, just understanding where startups are and understanding that the capital is needed to speed the process up theoretically, agnostic of what you look for. And so Birmingham's willingness to look beyond I'm a black woman, I don't look like I should have a tech company, I don't wear hoodies, like all this kind of deal, like that's where they've really stepped up. And it hasn't been in words, it's been in action.
Very cool. So that takes me a little bit to, I'd like to hear more about, I know St. Louis, sorry, I keep doing that, but they tell me it is St. Louis. St. Louis is an interesting case where you're helping seed the environment with startups, and you presented a little bit about the number of local companies that help support the endeavor in general. Do they work directly with the startups after helping fund Arch grants?
Yeah, so that's, I would say, the key part of our process that has allowed us to be as successful as we have in bringing and keeping startups is that, I kind of glossed over it when I was speaking before, but the 500 judges that we engage, and when I say that, so there's 300 that look at our entire applicant pool, help us to weed out and get us down to the final 50, and those 50 companies are invited to pitch live in St. Louis. 150 more judges come in to watch those companies pitch, to give them feedback, and ultimately to evaluate them. That's not just done because we feel like we need that many voices around the table to tell us what companies we should fund. It's because as soon as we decide on that final 20, we immediately turn around to that group and say, you brought them here. Mm-hmm. Now we need you to help keep them here. And they, in that case, that they really do. That's, I mean, more so as we've matured as an organization, as an ecosystem, the $50,000 is always going to be a great thing for people to get as entrepreneurs. But the idea of coming into this network that you can be so easily connected is also hugely valuable. And then in the same vein, we have several finalists that'll pitch live and get an investment from a venture capitalist that was a judge, and they won't get an Arch grant because they weren't a great fit, but there was still huge value in that. Mm-hmm. So the way that we engage the community is very strategically done so that the community is invested in these companies from the get-go. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Now, moving to a slightly more developed ecosystem overall, Minneapolis-St. Paul is a really interesting case study of the ability of companies to scale quickly. And I think from our conversations, part of that was the fact that there are so many companies that are global in reach in the area that can become clients of, customers of startups. Could you talk a little bit about where you really see the value there in MSP?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, you hit it on the head in terms of, what an entrepreneur needs is that kind of speed to connection for capital, customers, collaborators, talent, expertise, some other things, but those are some of the core. And so one of those opportunities of having those institutional assets is to think about, okay, based on the entrepreneur's experience, how can we use those institutional assets to get to those things? And organically, that's already been happening for decades. So on the collaborator front, the thing that's really happened in the last few years is a lot of the accelerators, some of them global accelerators that you've heard of, some of them local ones, have really brought out that talent and expertise that's kind of hidden in these institutions, right? Whether you're a food scientist at General Mills or whether you're working on new product development at 3M and connected that with the entrepreneur. And some of those folks are then jumping ship and others are then being nurtured until they're ready for acquisition by those institutions, which is how they've stayed alive for so long, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. And then the same thing's true on the capital side. So while after Chicago, we have the most kind of venture capital every year of any place in the Midwest, a lot of that is kind of hidden because of the institutional wealth that's in our region. And so breaking that open and making sure more people can access that is a top priority. And then on the customer base, right? The reason we have enterprise technology up there, if those are your customers, we're a metro of 3.5 million people. And so if you're gonna start some types of companies, you might do that in New York or LA or San Francisco. If enterprises are your customers, we compete with places 2-3 times our size. And so that's how we've kind of tried to focus that. But it's going to be the community that drives things forward, and the institutions kind of have to follow, and that's how it's worked in our region. It's not, you know, our entrepreneurs and others aren't waiting around for those institutions I mentioned to solve their problems, and so they've come to the table in the last few years in a big way.
Great. Now, I think one of the things that I found really interesting about what's happening in Erie is there's a long-time collaboration there between Penn State Erie, the Behrend College, which is the full title, and many local businesses. Now, the story with Minneapolis is one of, you know, the market has strong growth and has had strong growth for a long time. The story with many Rust Belt cities is that the economic headwinds are very negative overall. And that's something that Erie has faced, and through the collaborations that you've built, and that's both with community, with private industry, and with the other universities as well, which is a really incredible model that we don't see many places overall. You've created an environment where there is significant growth in a specific niche industry. Could you talk a little bit about the plastics in Erie?
Sure. So Erie in general still has higher than the national average in manufacturing in general. Plastics is actually one of our strongest areas. The plastics industry came to us probably 30 years ago now and asked us to create a program for plastics engineering technology to actually build a pipeline of people that they were needing in the workplace. So when I say that we have decades of interface with industry, that's a great example. We're one of 6 accredited plastics programs in the nation. There's 2 in Pennsylvania, Penn College of Technology and then Penn State Behrend, both in the Penn State system. They're the only 2 in Marcellus Shale territory. So for instance, when Shell is building the cracker plant down in Beaver County and they need an influx of folks, they're gonna look to the students in Pennsylvania, and we're the only 2 in Marcellus Shale. So it's well within our mission to help elevate the awareness of our students as to what the opportunities are, and then start to build those bridges between the manufacturers in that downstream supply chain that are going to be most affected by the Shell cracker plant coming in. And so we've done a lot of different activities to try to support that. But our students, in terms of the Rust Belt and how we work with manufacturing, we do it 2 ways. Number one, we help manufacturers understand how they can be more relevant and how they can diversify. If you had an opportunity to talk to Jake Marsh upstairs about Innovation Commons, he had a dog toy that was from essentially a manufacturer who had 80% of their portfolio with one company who recently left Erie. And they decided to diversify into dog toys. They came to our Innovation Commons, we helped them build it. They didn't realize their design was not right. It saved them about $30,000 of a mold just to get their part prototyped in our lab for free. And so helping those manufacturers understand the diversification that is possible is really important to the next generation that we're pumping out so that they have jobs to go into. And the other thing is just having interns and amass enough students to go out into the workforce in Erie, whether interns or full-time, can change the shape of how those old-time manufacturers think. So we had one company that was facing retiring workforce, which we hear all the time, and they ended up doing a really strong internship program with Penn State Behrend, and they had 33% of their workforce as Behrend students or graduates in the last 2 years, and they said it fundamentally changed the minds of, I'll call them the old timers in manufacturing, because they started getting a little competitive. Like, what are these young folks coming in and they have these crazy ideas? And then they're like, well, that crazy idea isn't so crazy. And then it started that culture of how can we take our manufacturing workforce and refresh it, but also get the people that have the institutional knowledge in manufacturing of 30 and 40 years, get them to think about it a little bit differently, and then fundamentally shifting manufacturing in a more relevant way. So those are 2 ways that we work with manufacturing in the Rust Belt perspective.
Very cool. I think there are 2 things that you touched on there that are pretty interesting, especially, and that's working to help diversify local industry and working to build our workforce that is able to supply local industry. I think there's a lot of correlation between that approach and a lot of what John's been talking about with the York Plan 2.0. Those 2 components, the workforce side of it is something that John's trying to create the jobs that then these people would take, but also the diversification of the local supply chain, we have, John's been doing a lot of work on getting a lot of our manufacturers here in York to understand that the components that they produce can be used in robotics. So I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that and how you hope to create the first place outside of Shenzhen, China, where we could wholly manufacture robotics as an assembler of components produced here.
Yeah, so I guess one of the big things, and I would call myself a former entrepreneur, not an entrepreneur. And in my last company that I started here, I really did mistake imitation for innovation. I'm gonna be honest, I don't wanna be an entrepreneur, I wanna be an industrialist. Like, I'm not interested in building a business, I wanna build an industry. And one of the reasons I stayed in York is because this is one of the few places I believe in the world that could actually do this. For those of you not familiar, the York Plan in 1940, we saved the world. Before the rest of the United States entered World War II, the leaders in New York saw it coming. It was actually in the spring of 1940. So 4 families were nominated to come up with a plan. They were given 6 months, 3 guiding principles. The first, everything from now on is about facing this one challenge. Doesn't matter what other people say. Doesn't matter whether they think it's coming or not. The war is happening whether we want it or not. The second is, for the time being, we put aside all political differences and wholeheartedly support the president in preparing the nation. So the nation was super divided back then, reeling from the Depression, World War I. We were protected by 2 oceans. We became isolationists. So a lot of stuff is repeating itself. And one of the things that came out of that was we can hate each other later. Like, nobody pretended to like each other. They still knew that they didn't really like each other. They just didn't like this other thing more. And then the third was, with all grace, they'd seek advice and counsel from every member of society. So you had the wealthiest people sitting down with the poorest. Owners of the factory sit down with the workers, even kids. So after 6 months using these 3 guiding principles, they announced what would be called the York Plan. It was a 15-point outline, but its practical outcome is people built makerspaces, a sharing economy popped up around tools, people were upskilled on a weekly basis. Manufacturers that were competitors began trading the downtime of their equipment. So it became Uberized. I mean, it was really amazing. The idea was no one could build a tank, but we could all build a piece. So pretty soon the whole economy locally pivoted to defense. When war was declared, the president didn't know what to do, sent out a request for proposals, and the York Plan was adopted by default because it was the only one not on paper. And York was only 6 months ahead. And so the whole nation adopted it through Rotary clubs under the slogan, do what you can with what you have. So when I was trying to get my first tech startup, I was basically trying to convince people we could be like someone else. Once I realized we've got all the pieces here, we just need to remember who we are, things started to tip. Like, even the way things are framed. I talk a lot about national security because we're a very patriotic community. Our manufacturers understand how important they are to not just the local economy, but the national and global economy. I even dress differently. I mean, for those of you that knew me back then, I looked like I was in a band. Now I drive a pickup truck and I grow a beard and carry a knife. And, but this is actually important. So if you were to come visit YorkX, we've managed to attract people from all over the world. So people from Brazil, South Korea, Bangladesh, India, California, Tennessee. And I realized that culturally, I wasn't having a problem attracting people. Like, we were being told we couldn't attract talent. I have master's degrees, PhDs. But as I was traveling, because we're very mission driven, the day to day, and sometimes it's not always the easiest environment to create a startup in. It's easy to start getting ripped apart. And the only place I ever saw people from a different background all coming together around the same thing and putting their differences aside was the Marine Corps. So when I was in the Marine Corps is very unique out of all the branches because it's steeped in legends, myths, and icons. So it's things that represent other things, which ties back to the York Plan and like this deep legacy infrastructure that's dormant, but it's hard to argue with. And so, so we have a knife ceremony where everyone gets a knife. This is the Marine Corps World II fighting knife. It's a K-bar. I had to earn it, so it allows me to give a piece of myself to them, but it's something they have to put on every day. So everyone walks around the office with these knives on. So it's like a physical thing they have to do. And I realized in a place like York, technology you can touch is very different. Like, the digital world is invisible, and it's very hard for people to participate. And even if you can, I can code, I hate it. I don't like sitting at a desk for a long period of time. And we have a lot of people here that are good with their hands. And so genetically, it made more sense to embrace that. And that's why we believe that York can do this. But that's why it's also important, I think, for us to be having this discussion, because what we're about to move into, none of us know. I mean, AI, robotics, this is going to change everything. And we can't do it alone. I don't think any one of us can do it alone. So we've kind of doubled down on this thing that we think we can do. But but there's going to be more opportunities than we can possibly imagine. So it's time for small communities to work together.
Yeah. And on that note, we'd love to have a few questions from the audience. You know, any topic, they are versed in many a thing. We have Peter right over here. Great.
So my question is for the entrepreneurs in the group. I'm not sure about how to support the industrialists yet, but I'm thinking about it. So what do you think of different capital structures for startups? Because I feel like the VC model, I mean, I don't know, I've always been one to say that we should be raising horses, not unicorns. Like we should be raising businesses that will stay in local economies and not try to get that 27x return and not try to find an IPO exit. And I'm wondering what capital structures you've tried. I mean, up in Rhode Island, we've tried a lot of revenue sharing as a structure, but right now I feel like the capital structures aren't working. The VC market's not working. The debt structures aren't working. If you're a small business, your chance of getting VC is pretty low unless you're in tech. So what do you think are the right capital structures to grow businesses and to help develop our regional economies?
Is that directed at me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, for us, you're right, in tech, you know, going after like that kind of institutional funding, although I have to tell you, I think my mom and I very quickly recognized that like that was gonna be a no-go route for us. Like, you know, the statistics for us are, on average, black women, when we started raising, were raising an average of $36,000, that's it, in seed funding, compared to a white male's 1.2 million at the same stage. It's a little stark. So we knew very quickly that wasn't gonna be the route for us, and we were gonna need to figure out how to do it differently. So the route that we did that has now worked is we bootstrapped. That's the first thing you always hear. You need to have your own skin in the game, so we were able to do that. But one thing I wanna say about that is the fact that my mom and I could bootstrap, that already makes entrepreneurship a sport for the elite. Because not everybody can bootstrap, not everybody can step out of their career and live on savings and do any of that. So that already like takes entrepreneurship out of the reach of so many, which is exactly the opposite of what entrepreneurship should be, specifically entrepreneurship in the United States. So after we did the bootstrapping, we were able to again successfully raise a round of friends and family. Again, that makes us in a sport for the elite. And one thing that I would love to say about that is, people when they see my mom and I doing this business together, they'll say to my mom, "Oh, it's so cute that your daughter lets you travel with her." I want to tell everybody here, she's the CEO of Mixtroz. I'm the president. But she's the CEO of Mixtroz for a reason, and it's because of the skill set that she brings. She's dangerous because she got a master's degree. She raised a family. She had a full-time job, and she did all of those, and now she's taken that experience to our startup. I always call my mom now, she is the Netflix of our startup. My mom's not Blockbuster. She's not going out of business. She keeps iterating. And so that's how I feel about that. But without my mom on this team, frankly, I don't think we would have been able to raise friends and family funds. The reason being, I'm a black female. People didn't want to give me money just yet. My friends certainly in their early 30s don't have disposable income because they're just getting married, they're having their baby, they're buying houses. Whereas my mom's friends, they had that wealth already where they could invest in our company. And then the third prong of that is really focusing on educating your communities, the people who do have the wealth, generational wealth. A lot of our friends and family around, some of it came from corporate entities, but a lot of it came from family offices and, local entrepreneurs who were already successful. So just really making sure that your market understands what the implications are when they reinvest those funds into technology. I think in Birmingham specifically, and I think this is a Southern thing, they would rather give their money to St. Jude because it makes them feel good without recognizing what they could do to spark an entire economy to invest the money into startups.
That's great.
Yeah.
Following off that a little, Emily.
I was going to say the one thing I would add, and I am not an entrepreneur, but have the privilege to work with hundreds of them every week. I think we found actually something similar with family offices in St. Louis is that there's, in a lot of these towns, there's a lot of intergenerational wealth that has been deployed philanthropically, that is being handed down generation to generation. There's an opportunity to inform that next generation about the potential for early stage investing. And to your point about raising horses versus raising unicorns, the nice thing about family office investment, and I can't say in your experience, but in what we've experienced, is that because there's not LPs involved, because it's part of a family's wealth, there's not that same sense of urgency on, I need to see an exit in 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is. A lot more of those, especially if they are investing partially in St. Louis companies and they're from St. Louis, they want to see a job creator. They want to see a wealth creator in the community, and they're willing to wait for it. And I think that's, there's some drawbacks to family offices getting into the venture space, and that's a conversation for another time. But one of the real benefits is that it can be a little bit more patient.
Well, and to just touch on that, so candidly, our first 2 years I bootstrapped, our first investment in was $5 million, all local. So we were able to do that, but the truth is, to be able to do that locally, I idolize guys like Henry Ford and Carnegie way more than Mark Zuckerberg. And those guys were patient. Like, that's what it takes, like patience and discipline to raise money somewhere like here. I mean, he didn't create the Model T till he was 40. And so I've been in New York for a long time, and it is sometimes a slog. Like, you just have to keep going and going and going and going. And those same investors, they're not looking for a quick flip or a quick return. They want to know that you're never going to stop, ever. Like, you're not going to leave. Like, you're going to just keep going. So this is my third company they've invested in. All here. One failed, and because I'd tried it, nobody else had done it before. The second one exceeded expectations. So this one, their first investment was $5 million. And so there's lots of money here, but the level of discipline and patience that it takes. And the other thing I realized too, the reason I dress the way I do when we talk like this, I need to adapt to the community. Like, the community needs to feel like they're a part of it. Not that I'm an entrepreneur rock star kind of thing where people feel like I'm an alien, maybe. And so that idea of just being disciplined and patient, the truth is that's how all of their money was made. They didn't make money by getting acquired by Google. They made money by building an industry and giving back to the community and providing jobs. So very often that's what they're looking to see in the entrepreneurs that they fund. Mm-hmm. And so it's here, it's everywhere. I mean, vast amounts of money. Just takes discipline and patience.
All right, we have a question back here.
Yes, a number of you have spoken about the involvement of large companies, and I'm wondering, what is their non-altruistic motivation for getting involved, and how do you appeal to it?
That's a great one.
Yeah, I guess one of the motivations is staying alive. But it's different for every company. So a lot of the companies that have jumped more into the space, some it's quite frankly, they want to attract and retain talent, right? And so having folks be around that community, mentoring folks, being part of the accelerator program or the mentorship program, that's a reason. For others, it's being closer to the products that maybe they acquired a few years later than they would have liked to. General Mills is one of those companies that acquired Annie's out of California a few years ago, and they have a kind of a group called 301 Inc. That for the first few years was kind of innovating products within General Mills that decided, hey, like, we need to be a lot earlier. We got to find Annie's 5 years before we found it. And so every company is a little bit different. It's an asset for our community. It's also a liability though, because we've got all these great companies where it can, once you get there and it's pretty comfortable, you make a good salary, maybe you got a 6-figure salary and things are good and your life's good, you lose a little bit of that sense of urgency. So that's kind of the kind of urgency of those entrepreneurs they're working with the patience and the knowledge and the wealth in those institutions is the kind of cocktail we're trying to figure out, how to keep alive and vibrant. So.
We have one right here.
John, question for you. I'm with Goodwill in Kansas City. Shout out to all the nonprofits here, right? You and me only. One thing that really speaks to me about York 2.0 is this concept of what is old is new. looking back at our American history and finding best practices there. But with Goodwill, we're the original social entrepreneur. And for us, the people that we serve in workforce development, people with diverse abilities and other barriers to employment, part of the thing that really speaks to me about York 2.0, I'd like to kind of talk about more, is that you are trying to develop the workforce alongside your grand vision for not only for York, but ultimately for America. Talk to us a little more about the Fortress. Talk to us a little more about workforce development in lockstep for this technological disruption. For me, I'm very concerned about the future state of work for the people that we particularly serve, and the fact that you're focusing on the development of workforce in lockstep, I think, is crucial for any tech industry. But anyway, if you would talk a little bit about the Fortress and workforce development in lockstep with that.
Sure, yeah. So, quite frankly, one of the things that terrifies me with what's coming is right now we have haves and have-nots, and I think it's very possible we will have haves and have-nevers. I mean, you will never catch up. It's already hard, like, for people to be a part of what's happened just with the app economy, right? So throw in robots, AI, I mean, self-improving technology, there is a very high chance that people will be left behind for thousands of years. I mean, it's hard for us to really wrap our heads around that. So I think we talked earlier about creating that sense of urgency. Like, I mean, this is not waiting for us. And when it tips, it's like a rocket ship. And it doesn't matter how hard you pedal, your bicycle is never going to catch up. And so, so for us, this is a big deal for us. So the idea of trying to make sure that we create an inclusive MEC ecosystem. The neat thing about the position we're in right now is a lot of CEOs, and I applaud you for being here, the CEO of a nonprofit. I mean, there are CEOs of billion-dollar corporations that are sleeping on this stuff. Like, they have no idea that it's happening at all. So in an age where you can Google anything, like it used to be knowledge is power, knowledge is no longer power. Secret knowledge is power. Like, if you know how to do something before other people, that's valuable. Mm-hmm. So some of the folks that you serve and some of the people that we're trying to train, it's not that they're going to be the most technically aptitude, it's just they're going to know how to do something before other people. So pretty soon, all the folks that were seen as liabilities are now assets, because they're unique, like they're uniquely skilled and uniquely positioned. They're going to know about robots before everyone else, about AI. Mm-hmm. They're going to take that skill. They're going to start their own companies, create microfactories. But yeah, it's a very complex issue, but that would be the hope I hope everyone takes away, that the haves and have-nots turning to haves and have-nevers creates a lot of problems for not just our community, but everyone.
Mm-hmm. And building on your unique skills in a community is also really great. If you're ahead of the curve, then you have the opportunity to write the playbook. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the things with Behrend and their plastics industry. They have such a depth of plastics knowledge in their workforce that any plastics company globally that's looking to expand into the United States looks at Erie first, which is not something that you hear as a story ever for small towns around Lake Erie in general. So yeah, that's very interesting. How we are ready to wrap up, so we're gonna move on right now. I thank you very much for all this. I think the conversation between regions about how to build these ecosystems is one of the primary purposes of this entire event. So please pick their brains at any of the breaks. I'm sure some of them are very happy to talk all the time. So go right ahead.
Got jokes.
And with that, we will move it along. So please, round of applause.